cardboard box was no bigger than a shoebox, tied shut with a piece of kitchen twine my mother had probably cut from one of her old apron strings, the one she wore until the fabric was so thin you could see the shadow of her hand through it. It was the last thing my brother David pulled from the back of her closet, and he tossed it into the black trash bag like it was full of dead cockroaches. The kind of toss that says this object has no value, no meaning, no right to exist. I pulled it back out that night after he and his wife had left, my hands shaking, the apartment still reeking of the lavender sachets she had sewn into the lining of every drawer, and inside the box I found a yellowed ledger book that smelled of dried basil and old grief. On the last page, in my mother's shaky handwriting, were the words, "He is stealing from you. I am so sorry I could not stop him. Count everything." That note was the fuse. By the time it finished burning 18 months later, I owned my brother's 5-bedroom colonial. His ex-wife was writing me rent checks every month, and he was watching his empire dissolve from inside a federal holding cell, trying to understand how the quiet sister who spent 30 years in a hot kitchen had just dismantled his entire life like a poorly constructed souffle. But before any of that could happen, I had to learn how to smile while he tried to strip me bare. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you believe that blood relation is not a free pass to bleed someone dry. Now let me take you back to where it all began, long before the box, long before the theft, back when a $5,000 catering cart was the biggest gamble my family ever took. My name is Alina Marchetti, named after my mother, though everyone called me Lena. In 1998, I was 26 years old, fresh out of culinary school in Providence, working the line at a hotel restaurant that paid me $11 an hour plus a shift meal that was usually a dried-out chicken breast and a scoop of instant mashed potatoes. My brother David was 28, a business school dropout who had spent 3 years selling vacuum cleaners door to door and had developed a salesman's smile and a checkbook that bounced as reliably as a tennis ball. Our mother, Alina Sr., was a seamstress who had raised us alone in a 2-bedroom apartment above a dry cleaner in Pawtucket after our father walked out when I was 7 and never sent a dime of child support. She worked 14-hour days, hunched over a Singer industrial machine, hemming trousers for a chain that paid her 35 cents per garment, and she saved every nickel she could not spend on rent or canned soup. I still remember the sound of that machine, a relentless mechanical chugging that started before I woke up and ended after I went to sleep, the smell of hot machine oil and steam from the press, and the way her knuckles would swell up every winter until she could barely hold a needle. She was the quietest kind of hero, the kind who never complained and never rested, and who believed that the only thing she could leave her children was the dignity of honest work. She never let us see her cry, but once when I was maybe 10, I found her sitting at the kitchen table at 2 in the morning, staring at a pile of bills with a pencil in her hand, the numbers so tight and close together they looked like a foreign language. She looked up at me and smiled, a smile that cost her something, and said, "Lena, when you have nothing, you learn to count everything. Every dime, every stitch, every minute, because if you don't, somebody else will count it for you and take it away." I sat down next to her, and she showed me her budget book, each line item in her careful script, and she taught me arithmetic by making me add up the grocery receipts. She said, "This is how you build a wall around yourself, not with anger, but with attention." That lesson would become the foundation of everything I did later, though I didn't know it then. In the spring of 1998, she sat us down at the Formica kitchen table, the one with the cigarette burn from a neighbor who had long since moved away, and pushed a coffee can across to us. Inside was $5,000 in crumpled 20s and 10s, the sum total of 22 years of pinching pennies until they screamed. Her hands were swollen with arthritis, her knuckles permanently curled into the shape of a seamstress's claw, and she said, "You two have all the talent in the world but no direction. Buy something that feeds people. I will hold a piece of it so I know you will not throw it away on foolishness." She did not say, "Don't fight," or "take care of each other." She said, "I will hold a piece of it," because she already sensed, I think, that shared blood was not enough to guarantee shared honesty. She had watched David from his teenage years, seen him borrow money from her jar and never replace it, seen him charm his way out of school suspensions with a wink and a story. She loved him fiercely, but she was not blind. She knew that a person could be family and still be a fox in the henhouse, and that $5,000 coffee can was her way of building a coupe with a lock on it. I didn't fully understand that until decades later, but looking back, I see her genius in everything she did. Even the way she tied the twine around that box in her closet, years later, was a seamstress's knot. Tight, intentional, impossible to unravel without work. That summer, we bought a used 1987 Ford Econoline step van at a police auction for $3,200. It had a griddle, a steam table, a banged-up refrigerated prep unit, and a faded decal on the side that said Sal's Sausage Kingdom in peeling crimson letters. The inside smelled like stale fryer oil and whatever Sal had been smoking in the back, and the floor was sticky with a decade of food spills that had polymerized into a kind of amber fossil. We scrubbed that van for 2 weeks straight, using industrial degreaser, putty knives, and the kind of elbow grease you only have when you are young and terrified of failing. I remember the first time I climbed into the back after the auction, the way my sneakers clung to the floor with an audible squelch, and David stood outside laughing, saying it looked like a crime scene. We tore out the old shelving, which was rusted and sagging, and found a mummified hot dog behind the fridge unit that we handled with tongs and a lot of gagging. David, to his credit, worked right alongside me in those first weeks, his salesman's loafers ruined by grease, his hands raw from the scrub brushes. There was a moment, late one night, when we were both exhausted and sitting on the curb eating gas station sandwiches, and he looked at me and said, "Lena, we're really going to do this, aren't we? We're not going to end up like Dad or like Mom scraping by. We're going to build something that lasts." I believed him. I believed that we were in it together. My mother repainted the exterior herself, cream with hunter green trim, using a brush and a roller because we could not afford a spray gun. She hand-lettered Elena's Kitchen on the side in flowing script, her arthritic fingers somehow finding a steadiness they never had on anything else. She spent 2 days on just the lettering, crouched on a milk crate with a tiny artist's brush, and when she was done, she stepped back and looked at it, and I saw tears in her eyes for the first time since my father left. She touched the E of Elena, the capital letter that was exactly the way she signed her name, and she said, "This is the best thing I ever sewed. Even if it's paint, it's a seam that holds something together." That van was not just a vehicle. It was her signature on our future, a promise that we would carry her name into every parking lot we parked in. The deal was simple. David would handle the money, the permits, the marketing, the business development. I would cook. We would each own 40%, and she would hold 20% as our silent partner, a guardrail against the reckless ambition she always sensed in David but could never quite name. We sealed it with a handshake and a slice of my mother's ricotta pie, the one with the orange zest and the pine nuts that she only made for special occasions. And I believed, with all the naivete of a 26-year-old who had never been betrayed, that this was the beginning of something permanent and good. My mother, as she dished out the pie, looked at David and said, "David, you run the numbers, but your sister is the heart. Don't ever forget that the heart pumps the blood. Without it, everything dies." He nodded and smiled and kissed her cheek, and I didn't see the flicker in his eyes, the tiny tightening around his mouth that said he was already calculating how to bypass the heart entirely. I was too busy tasting the orange zest, too full of hope, too convinced that family meant something beyond words on a legal pad. For 25 years, I was the first person in that kitchen, whatever kitchen we had at the time. In the early days, we rented space in a commissary in Central Falls, a concrete block building that smelled of bleach and raw chicken, and I would wake at 3:45 every morning, drive the van over in the dark, and start prepping. The commissary had a row of shared gas burners and a cooler that sometimes shorted out and spoiled everything inside. So I learned to check the temperature every hour with a probe thermometer I wore on a lanyard around my neck. I made fresh fettuccine by hand, 50 pounds at a stretch, rolling out sheets of semolina dough until my palms blistered, and the blisters popped and bled into the dough, which I had to throw away because you can't serve blood-streaked pasta. I learned to wrap my hands in athletic tape before long shifts, learned to keep a pumice stone for the calluses. I made marinara in 20-gallon batches, stirring with a wooden paddle that was taller than my mother, tasting every 10 minutes, adjusting the basil and the garlic until it tasted like home. We could not afford a proper range hood in those days, so the commissary would fill with steam so thick you could barely see, and I would navigate by memory and the red glow of the pilot lights, a ghost in a fog of tomato and onion. I did not have a staff for the first 5 years. I was the chef, the dishwasher, the inventory manager, and the person who mopped the floors at midnight while listening to the radio play old jazz. David handled the business side from his laptop at a coffee shop, then from a desk in a shared office, then from a glass-walled corner office in a building we bought in 2012. He was good at it. I will give him that. He knew how to talk to investors, how to negotiate leases, and how to make a single catering van sound like the beginning of a national empire. I remember the first time he brought an investor to the commissary, a man in a suit that cost more than our van. And David talked about scalability and market penetration while I stood in the back, my apron stained, and the investor looked at me like I was a piece of the equipment. David never introduced me by name. He would wave a hand and say, "And back there is our kitchen, the engine of the operation," as if the engine was a thing, not a person. It stung, but I told myself that was his job, to sell the vision. And my job was to make sure the vision didn't poison anyone with undercooked chicken. By 2019, Alina's Kitchen had 2 food trucks, a brick-and-mortar cafe in the financial district with a line out the door every lunch hour, a 15,000-square-foot production kitchen in an industrial park off Route 128, and a 5-year exclusive catering contract with a global software company headquartered in Boston. That contract was my baby. I had done the tasting for their CEO, Jonathan Hale, a quiet man with a peanut allergy and a love for authentic Italian, and I had won the bid against 3 national chains by showing up with a handwritten menu and a sample of my mother's gnocchi that made him close his eyes and swear in appreciation. Our gross revenue hit $2.4 million that year. I was earning a salary of $68,000. David was pulling $240,000 plus performance bonuses, driving a black Tesla Model S that he had custom-ordered with white leather seats, and living in a sprawling new colonial in Wellesley with his wife Tiffany, a former sorority social chair who had never worked a day after her real estate license lapsed in 2011. He had a pool, a 3-car garage, and a wine cellar that held bottles he could not pronounce. I did not complain. I drove a 12-year-old Honda CR-V with a cracked windshield and 1 working speaker, the driver's seat worn through to the foam where my thigh rested. My apartment was a 1-bedroom walk-up in Somerville, with a radiator that sounded like a man hitting a pipe with a wrench and a bathtub that drained so slowly you showered in a puddle of yesterday's grief. I had no husband, no children, no hobbies beyond the occasional used cookbook I would buy at a library sale. The business was my identity, my legacy, my mother's name painted on every van and every menu. Every time I saw Alina's Kitchen, in black script on a delivery truck, I felt her still with me, her arthritic fingers blessing every recipe. I would stand at the cafe counter sometimes, just before opening, and run my hand over the menu board, and I could swear the wood was warm, like a stove that never goes out. That was enough. That had to be enough. David was the face of the company. He wore tailored suits from a tailor on Newbury Street, gave keynote speeches at small business conferences with a wireless microphone clipped to his lapel, and posted inspirational LinkedIn updates about bootstrapping from a single cart to an empire, with a photo of the original step van, which we had kept in a storage unit for sentiment. My name appeared nowhere in the marketing. I did not mind, or I told myself I did not mind, because I was genuinely uncomfortable with attention, the way some people are uncomfortable with heights. When a local food magazine wanted to do a feature on the mystery chef behind the business, David told them I declined all interviews. He never asked me. I learned about it 3 years later from a framed article in the office bathroom, a glossy spread with a photo of a stock image model in a chef coat standing in front of our van. The model had blonde hair and a bright red lipstick, and she was holding a whisk like she had never held a whisk before in her life. I stared at that article for a long time, the fluorescent lights humming above me, and I felt something small and cold settle in my chest, like a sliver of ice that would not melt. I told myself it was just David's way, that he was protecting me from the spotlight, and I went back to the kitchen where the steam was familiar and the knives were sharp and I did not have to think about it. But that night I went home and I took out a notepad and I wrote down, for the first time, every single thing that bothered me about David. The list was 3 pages long. Years of little slights, little erasures, moments when he had taken credit for my work or dismissed my opinions. I folded it up and put it in my underwear drawer, and I never showed it to anyone. But writing it down made me feel like I had finally named a ghost. Our mother's dementia began showing its teeth in 2017. At first, it was just repeated questions and lost keys, the kind of forgetfulness that comes with age. I would call her, and she would ask me why I hadn't visited in months, even though I had been there the day before, and I would gently remind her, and she would laugh and say, "Oh, my mind is like a sieve lately." But then the holes in the sieve got bigger. She forgot how to thread her sewing machine, her hands shaking as she tried to make the needle catch the bobbin thread, a skill that had been muscle memory for 50 years. She started putting the milk in the cabinet and the cereal in the fridge. Once I found a stack of bills she had hidden inside the oven, and when I asked her why, she said she was protecting them from the man who came through the windows at night. There was no man. There were no windows in her hallway. By 2020, she could no longer recognize me for more than a few minutes at a stretch. We placed her in a memory care facility in Wrentham, a place with a garden and a therapy dog named Gus and windows that looked out on a bird feeder she never remembered filling. The facility cost $9,000 a month, and David paid it out of the business account, marking it as executive medical expense, which I never questioned because it seemed like the one decent thing he did. Later, I learned he had written it off as a tax deduction for the company, not a personal expense, which meant he was effectively making the business pay for our mother's care while he took the credit. Classic David. I visited her every Wednesday evening without fail, driving 40 minutes through whatever weather New England threw at me, bringing a Tupperware of her own marinara, the same recipe I still used, with the exact balance of San Marzano tomatoes and fresh basil she had taught me when I was tall enough to see over the stove. The facility had a small kitchen for families, and I would heat up the sauce and serve it in a bowl I had brought from her old apartment, a chipped yellow bowl she had fed me from as a child. She would eat it and smile and tell me it was very good, but her daughter made it better, and I would smile and agree and not let her see me cry. Sometimes, after the meal, she would drift off in her chair while I read to her from an old recipe book, and I would just sit there, holding her hand, watching the birds at the feeder, memorizing the lines of her face. Those Wednesdays were sacred to me, a pocket of time where the business didn't exist, where David's ambition didn't hum in the background like a refrigerator that never shuts off. Sometimes I would find David's business cards in her room, the ones with the embossed gold lettering, tucked into a drawer or on the windowsill, never a sign that he had actually been there that week. Once I found a card with a sticky note attached in his handwriting. "Mom, call me when you're lucid. We need to discuss the shares." I tore it up and flushed it down the toilet. I asked the nursing staff how often he visited, and the head nurse, a kind woman named Patricia, hesitated before saying, "Maybe 4 times in the last 2 years, and he never stays more than 10 minutes. He usually just talks to the business office about billing." I thanked her and walked to my car, and I sat in the parking lot for an hour, not crying, just breathing, the engine off in the cold, watching the light fade from the sky. I thought about confronting him, about marching into his office and demanding he look at the mess he was making of anything that didn't produce revenue, but I was too exhausted, too focused on keeping the kitchen running and my mother comfortable, to start a war. I told myself that after she passed, I would reevaluate everything. I told myself I had time. In one lucid moment in the summer of 2021, a moment so sharp it cut through the fog like a blade, she gripped my wrist with surprising strength, her fingers digging into my tendons, and looked me dead in the eye. Her gaze was clear and fierce, and so much like the woman who had once marched into a landlord's office and demanded a rent reduction with nothing but a ledger book and a spine of iron. "Lena," she said, her voice low and urgent, "I changed something. It is in the box. You will know it when you need it. The box in the closet behind the winter coats. Do not let him throw it away." I asked her what she meant, what box, what she had changed, but her focus was already slipping, her eyes flickering to the window, her hand relaxing. She said, "The birds. Look at the cardinal. Red is such a brave color, don't you think?" And then she was gone again, back into the mist, and I sat there holding her hand, wondering if that moment had been a true beacon or just another phantom from a brain that was rewiring itself randomly. I made myself a mental note about the closet and the box and the winter coats, but I didn't act on it, because that week we had a health inspection at the production kitchen and a broken steam kettle that had flooded the floor, and I was so deep in crisis management that I tucked my mother's cryptic warning into the same mental drawer where I kept all the things I couldn't face yet. I convinced myself it was just her confusion, a random firing of neurons that had assembled a story. I didn't want to believe there was a real threat, because believing it would mean accepting that my brother was something I couldn't fix with more work and more silence. She died on a Tuesday in March of 2023, during a nor'easter that knocked out power to half the state. I was holding her hand when her breathing stopped, the snow piling up against the window like a pressed white sheet, the room so quiet I could hear the hum of the heating vent and the distant beep of a call button. The facility had backup generators, so the lights stayed on, a harsh fluorescent glow that made everything look clinical and cold. But I had turned on a small lamp by her bed, one I had brought from her apartment, with a shade she had sewn herself, and that light was warm and yellow, the color of butter. I sat there for 20 minutes after, holding her hand as it cooled, memorizing the lines of her face and the smell of her skin, a smell of soap and lavender and the faintest trace of the machine oil from all those years at the Singer. I talked to her. I told her every recipe I would never forget, every lesson she had taught me, every time I had watched her hands, those miraculous hands, turn something broken into something whole. Then I walked into the hallway and called David. The first thing he said, after a pause that was about 3 seconds too long, was, "Okay, we need to talk about the company structure. Mom's shares. I'll have my attorney send something over tomorrow. Don't worry about any of it. I'll take care of you." The word care landed like a stone dropped into a well, hollow and echoing, and I hung up and stood in that linoleum corridor, the fluorescent lights buzzing overhead, and I felt something shift in my spine, a cold recognition that the man on the other end of the phone was not my brother anymore. He was a snake uncoiling before the strike. The funeral was a small affair, sleet and slush and a priest who mispronounced her maiden name. It was held at the church she had attended for 40 years, a small stone building with a leak in the roof that had stained the ceiling in the shape of a heart, which seemed appropriate. I gave the eulogy, standing at a lectern that wobbled every time I shifted my weight, and I talked about her hands, those hands that had sewn 1,000 hems and stirred 1,000 pots, and I did not cry because I had run out of tears somewhere around 3 a.m. The night before, lying in my childhood bedroom in her apartment, the bed still smelling of the sachets. I talked about the coffee can, the $5,000, the way she had poured her whole life into that can and handed it to us with nothing but faith. I saw David in the third row, his head bowed, his shoulders shaking with what might have been grief or might have been performance, and I wondered if he was calculating the tax implications of her death even then. Tiffany wore a black dress that cost more than my mother's entire funeral, some designer label I did not recognize, and she spent half the service checking her phone behind a crumpled tissue, her thumb scrolling through something with the bored expression of a woman waiting for a latte. At the repast in their Wellesley home, with its soaring foyer and its catered trays of miniature quiches that I could have made better in my sleep, David handed me a thick manila envelope and said, "This is the buyout agreement. Mom's 20% plus your 40%. I'm offering you a clean exit, Lena. $500,000. You can finally retire, travel, do whatever you want. I've already got a great executive chef lined up, a young guy from Johnson and Wales. You've earned it." He said it with the same tone he used for his conference speeches, warm and generous and utterly hollow. I looked at the document, at the signature page with my name already typed beneath a blank line, and I felt the floor tilt. I had not asked for a buyout. I had never mentioned wanting to leave. The business was the only thing that kept me breathing, the only place where I still felt my mother beside me, in every pot of sauce, every sheet of pasta. But I smiled, the way I had learned to smile after decades in a hot kitchen when a server sent back a plate and you had to pretend it did not wound you, and I said, "Let me look this over, David. I'm a little foggy right now. Grief, you know." Tiffany's eyes narrowed, a flicker of something cold beneath the mascara. She had a way of looking at me like I was a smudge on a glass coffee table, something that should be wiped away and forgotten. "Of course, Lena, take your time," she sang, her voice dripping with that particular brand of performative empathy that means the exact opposite. "We just want to make sure you're taken care of. You've worked so hard, you poor thing. You deserve a rest." The word rest landed like a pebble in still water, and the ripples spread. They wanted me out. Not retired, not honored. Out. Erased. Later that afternoon, David announced that we needed to clear out our mother's apartment before the end of the month to avoid another rent cycle. "I'll take care of the furniture and the estate sale," he said, already pulling up a junk removal service on his phone. "You don't need to lift a finger. Just let me know if there's anything sentimental you want, and I'll set it aside." I knew what would happen. Anything of value would be inventoried and sold, and the rest would be bagged and dumped before I could blink. The entire life of Alina Marchetti Sr. reduced to a dumpster behind a senior complex. So I insisted on going with him the next day. We met at her apartment, a one-bedroom on the ground floor, the air still smelling of her lavender sachets and the faint metallic tang of her old sewing machine, which sat in the corner like a loyal dog waiting for its owner to return. I ran my hand over the singer's worn wheel, the black paint chipped where her thumb had rested 1,000,000 times, and I felt the ghost of every hem she had ever sewn. I pressed my forehead to the cool metal of the arm and I whispered, "Mama, I'm here. Help me see what I need to see." David moved through the rooms like a landlord conducting an eviction, yanking open drawers, muttering about the junk filling black contractor bags with a brutality that made my stomach clench. He threw her wedding photo album into a bag, the one with the cracked leather cover, and I had to bite my tongue to keep from screaming. He pulled a small cardboard box from the back of the coat closet, behind the winter coats, just as she had said. A box about 8 inches by 10 inches, the corners soft with age, tied with a piece of frayed kitchen twine. He lifted the lid, peered inside, and his face curled into disgust. Old bills, recipe clippings, some kind of ledger. She was a pack rat, God bless her. Trash. He dropped it into the bag and cinched the drawstring with a hard tug, and my heart hammered against my ribs so hard I thought he might hear it. The words from that lucid moment came flooding back. "The box in the closet, behind the winter coats. Do not let him throw it away." I said nothing. I waited until they went down to the dumpster with the first load, their voices fading down the corridor, and then I pulled the box out of the bag, the plastic rustling like a confession, stuffed it into my oversized tote beneath a folded cardigan, and carried it out of that apartment like it contained the bones of a saint. That night, alone in my Somerville apartment with the radiator clanking its familiar rhythm and the streetlight casting orange bars across the linoleum floor, I untied the twine and opened the box. The smell that rose up was a time machine, dried basil, old paper, the faint ghost of my mother's hand lotion, a brand called Jergens that she had used since the 1970s. Inside were old bills, neatly folded and organized by year, a stack of recipes written on index cards in my mother's handwriting, each one a fragment of my childhood. Gnocchi, marinara, braciole, the orange zest ricotta pie. The cards smudged with olive oil and tomato sauce from decades of use. And there was a ledger book with a red cloth cover, the kind an old-fashioned shopkeeper might use, its spine cracked and its pages yellowed. I opened it and saw columns of numbers in blue ink, but not in my mother's hand. These were my brother's numbers from the early years of the business, I realized, probably a duplicate set my mother had kept, watching over the finances in her own quiet way. She had been auditing him, even then, even before her mind faltered, sitting at her kitchen table with that same pencil and that same fierce attention she had taught me as a child. And then, carefully folded and pressed flat against the back cover, I found a will. A new will, dated November 2021, notarized and witnessed by 2 people whose names I did not recognize, that voided all prior wills and specifically bequeathed my mother's 20% stake in Alina's Kitchen LLC to me, and me alone, with a provision that if David contested it, he would forfeit any claim to her estate entirely. It was a dead man's switch, a final, unassailable lock on her legacy, triggered by her love for me and her quiet, devastating clarity about who her son had become. Beneath the will, a separate sheet of paper, lined and torn from a spiral notebook, with just 2 sentences in my mother's unmistakable script, the letters trembling with the effort of someone whose mind was already slipping but whose heart was still furious and clear. "He is stealing from you. I am so sorry I could not stop him. Count everything." I sat there for a long time, the heat of the radiator baking the side of my leg, the ledger open in my lap, and I began to count. I went through the columns, comparing her notes to what I remembered of the early financials. At first it was just intuition, a sense that the numbers didn't add up, but then I started cross-referencing with a mental inventory of every major purchase we had made. I had kept careful records myself, initially on a clipboard in the van, then in a series of notebooks, then in spreadsheets on a laptop. I pulled out my own records, the ones I had stored in a fireproof box under my bed, and I spread them across the floor. The suspect entries were like small, discrete cuts on a piece of meat, hard to see unless you were looking for the pattern. There were withdrawals marked Equipment Rep for equipment repairs that I knew we had never made, small amounts at first, a few $100s here and there in 1999 and 2000, then larger sums as the business grew. $1,200 in 2005 for a ventilation upgrade that I knew we had not done until 2008, and I remembered because I had burned my arm on the old hood the day before the upgrade. I still had the scar, a pink crescent on my forearm. $1,700 in 2011 for a consultant fee that I had never approved. I remembered that year clearly because we had nearly lost the cafe lease, and I was working 18-hour shifts to keep us afloat, and no one had mentioned any consultant. $4,000 in 2014 for ingredient sourcing that I couldn't recall authorizing. By 3 a.m., my coffee cold and my eyes gritty, I had identified over 80 suspicious entries. I cross-referenced the dates with my own mental timeline of our equipment purchases and our actual expenses, and none of the suspect entries matched anything real. My brother had been skimming from the very beginning, in amounts so small and so carefully disguised that I would never have noticed without this ledger. And based on the pattern, it had never stopped. The withdrawals had grown as the business grew, like a parasite that fattens on the host. I did not sleep that night. I sat at my tiny kitchen table with a fresh pot of coffee, a calculator, and a legal pad, and I began to understand that the buyout offer was not generosity. It was the final act of a 25-year heist. If I signed away my 40%, I would walk away with $500,000, while David, through the shell accounts I now suspected existed, would control the full company and all the money he had already salted away. My mother had seen it before the dementia swallowed her mind, and she had tried to protect me from beyond the grave. Now I just had to prove it, and I had to do it before they realized I was not the confused, grieving fool they thought I was. I looked at the will again, at my mother's signature, shaky but unmistakable, and I made a vow to her. I would be her hands, I would be her attention, I would count everything. The next morning, David called me at 7 a.m., his voice a little too bright, the way it always was when he was about to ask for something. "Hey, sis, just checking in. I know you wanted to look over the paperwork, but honestly, it's pretty straightforward. My lawyer says we can close by the end of the week if you're feeling up to it. We want to get everything squared away before the Q2 tax filings. You know how it is. Tiffany and I would love to have you stay in the guest house while you figure out your next chapter. It would be so nice to have you close." I could hear Tiffany in the background, her voice a distant chirp. "Tell her I'm making up the blue room, the one with the garden view." I understood immediately what they were doing. They wanted me under their roof where they could monitor me, control the narrative, and apply steady pressure. In my fragile state, they probably assumed I would be compliant, grateful even for the shelter. They would ply me with tea and sympathy and slowly tighten the noose until I signed away everything I had ever built. I decided to give them exactly what they expected, a sad, confused old woman who could barely find her slippers. It wasn't hard to play that role, because part of me was genuinely exhausted, genuinely heartbroken, but I tapped into those feelings and amplified them, the way you might turn up a burner to reduce a sauce. I made my voice tremble, not just with grief, but with a kind of helplessness that I knew would feed their confidence. "You know, David," I said, letting the waver wobble the edges of my words, "that actually sounds so lovely. I'm just really struggling with the paperwork. My mind is just foggy, you know? I can't seem to focus on anything for more than a few minutes. The grief, it's just overwhelming. Maybe being around family will help me think clearly." The pause on his end lasted half a beat too long, just enough for me to hear the satisfaction in it, the little click of a puzzle piece fitting into place, and then he said, "Of course, Lena. Absolutely. Take all the time you need. I'll have my assistant send a car for you tomorrow." I moved into the guest house that weekend. It was a detached 2-room cottage behind the main colonial with its own bathroom, a kitchenette, and a wrought iron dabed that Tiffany had dressed in so many throw pillows it looked like a textile funeral. The pillows were beige and cream, and had words like "breathe" and "gather" embroidered on them in tasteful script, and I wanted to throw every single one of them into the pool. The windows faced the main house's back patio, giving me a clear sightline to the kitchen and David's home office, a glass-walled room on the first floor with a mahogany desk that looked like it had been airlifted from a law firm. I unpacked my suitcase slowly, placing my mother's box in the nightstand drawer beneath a Bible I never read, and I began the most critical performance of my life. The role of the grieving, confused, financially illiterate older sister who would eventually sign whatever was put in front of her because she simply could not cope. The first week was an exercise in patience. I shuffled around the guest house in a worn cardigan I had owned since the Clinton administration, napped in the afternoons with the curtains drawn, and let Tiffany bring me mugs of chamomile tea that I strongly suspected she spat in before handing over. She would set the mug down with a delicate clink and say things like, "You poor thing, you've just given so much of yourself." And I would nod and thank her and imagine the expression on her face when she found out what I was actually doing. One afternoon, she brought me a care package of lavender bath salts and a self-help book on mindfulness, and I thanked her so profusely I nearly made myself sick. David came by every evening, his footsteps heavy on the gravel path, carrying a leather portfolio and a smile that was practiced in a mirror. "The new chef is settling in great, Lena," he would say, "but don't worry, it's just a temporary thing. We're keeping your seat warm." He talked about the new menu items the young chef was trying, a deconstructed tiramisu and a squid ink pasta that I knew our customers would hate, and I nodded and asked vague, slightly confused questions about ingredient suppliers and the walk-in cooler temperature. I asked him what a deconstructed tiramisu was, as if the concept was beyond my comprehension, and he explained it to me with the patience of a kindergarten teacher, his voice dripping with condescension. He would pat my shoulder and tell me not to think about any of that, just rest, and there was a condescension in the pat that made my teeth ache. About 10 days in, he slid a revised document across the kitchen island while I was sitting there, staring blankly at a cup of tea. The buyout agreement was now 24 pages, dense with legalese, and included a non-compete clause that would bar me from working in the food industry anywhere in New England for 10 years, a non-disparagement clause that would prevent me from ever saying anything negative about the company or its ownership, and a release of all claims against the company and its officers forever. "Just some standard boilerplate," he said, his pen hovering like a guillotine, a heavy silver pen with the company logo engraved on the side. "No rush, just when you're ready." I picked up the pen, held it for a moment over the signature line, let my hand tremble visibly. I even spilled a little tea on the corner of the page, which made Tiffany gasp and rush for a napkin, and then I set it down with a sigh. "I'm sorry, David, I need to feel a little more clear-headed. The fog, you know. Maybe next week." His jaw tightened for just a second, a tiny seismic event in the placid face he wore, and then the smile returned. "Of course, next week. Take all the time you need, sis." He squeezed my shoulder again, harder this time, and left the document on the table like a threat. That night, I began my real work. At 2 a.m., when the main house was dark and silent except for the hum of the pool filter, I sat cross-legged on the cold tile floor of the guest house bathroom, the ventilation fan running to mask any sound, and I opened my laptop. I had spent 30 years in a commercial kitchen, but I had also spent 30 years managing food costs, inventory, and profit margins down to the penny. I knew how to read a balance sheet, a profit and loss statement, a chart of accounts. I knew that every business leaves a paper trail, and I knew that David's arrogance would have led him to keep records somewhere. He was the kind of man who believed his own fiction so completely that he couldn't imagine anyone contradicting it, which meant he probably kept trophies, little monuments to his own cleverness, tucked away in a drawer like a serial killer keeps a lock of hair. I also knew, from a decade of handling our own equipment repairs back when we could not afford a repairman, how to pick a basic wafer lock. In the early years, when the van's cash register drawer would jam, or the lock on the commissary door would freeze, I was the one who had to fix it. I learned from a manual I checked out of the public library, a slim volume with a cracked spine and a title like Practical Locksmithing for the Homeowner. And I practiced on the junk drawer locks in our apartment until I could open a simple pin tumbler in under a minute. I had a small leather case of lock picks and shims that I had bought at a hardware store in 2003, a set of tension wrenches and rake picks, and a tiny diamond pick that I had reshaped with a file to better fit the locks we used on our walk-in cooler. I had kept that case, tucked into the lining of my suitcase, because old habits die hard and old tools are the only friends you can truly trust. Before I went to sleep that night, I tested the picks on the guest house door lock, just to make sure my hands still remembered the motion, and it clicked open in 40 seconds, smooth as a trout slipping a hook. The lock on David's home office filing cabinet, I guessed from a quick daytime reconnaissance when I, accidentally, wandered into the house looking for the bathroom, was a cheap 4-pin tumbler, the kind you could bypass in under 90 seconds with a tension wrench and a rake pick. I did a dry run the next day, pretending to get lost on my way to the kitchen, and I memorized the layout. The camera at the front gate pointed outward, the motion sensor lights in the backyard, which only triggered if you crossed the patio, the mudroom door, which I saw David leave unlocked when he came in from the garage because he was too busy talking on his phone. I noted the dog next door, a terrier that barked from 10 p.m. to 11 p.m., and then quieted down. I waited 3 nights, letting the rhythm of the house settle into a predictable hum. On the 3rd night, at 2:17 a.m., I slipped out of the guest house wearing dark clothes and soft-soled sneakers, my picks in my pocket and a small maglite held between my teeth. The mudroom door was unlocked, as I had known it would be, because David was arrogant about his security system and thought the cameras on the front gate were enough. He did not know that I had memorized the camera angles from a casual walk around the property, noting the blind spots like a cook noting the hot spots on a grill. The house was cavernous and cold, the marble floors sucking the heat from my feet even through the sneakers. I moved through the kitchen, past the Viking range that had never been used for anything more complex than heating up takeout, and into the hallway where David's office sat behind a glass door. The office was a monument to his ego, framed awards, a photo of him shaking hands with a senator, a bookshelf filled with unread business bestsellers with the spines still crisp, and in the corner beneath the window, a 2-drawer metal filing cabinet with a simple keyhole. I knelt down, my heart beating in my throat, and went to work. I took a breath to steady my hands, the way I used to do before a big plating rush, and I inserted the tension wrench, applying the lightest pressure, just enough to feel the pins resist. Then the rake pick, moving it in and out with a gentle rocking motion, like the whisk of a sauce, and I felt the pins set one by one with a soft click that was louder in my mind than it was in the silent room. The drawer slid open with a whisper of metal on metal, a sound of dark secrets being given permission to breathe. Most of the folders were what you would expect: payroll, tax filings, equipment financing, legal correspondence. But tucked in the back, behind a partition, was a red hanging file labeled simply Marigold. I pulled it out, my fingers steady even as my pulse raced, and opened it to find bank statements from a branch in the Cayman Islands for a company called Marigold Holdings LLC, registered in Delaware. The statements showed regular transfers from Alina's Kitchen's operating account, disguised as vendor payments to a fictitious food service supplier named Atlantic Coast Provisions. I had never heard of Atlantic Coast Provisions. The transfers started small in 2010, around $900 a month, but they grew as the business grew. By 2019, they were $12,000 a month. I photographed every page with my phone, the camera shutter muted, and then I found a document that turned the nausea in my stomach into a cold, still fury. A signature card for the Marigold account with 2 authorized signatories, David Marchetti and his wife, Tiffany. There was more. Behind the Marigold folder was a thin folder labeled Lena Buyout Drafts, and inside were multiple versions of the buyout agreement dating back to 2022, months before our mother died. One of them contained a forgery of my signature on the acceptance page. I recognized the loops on the capital L and the way the A at the end trailed off into a little flourish, because it was my actual signature, photocopied from a separate document and digitally pasted onto the signature line. I had never signed anything in 2022. I had not even been aware of any buyout discussion. This was a criminal act, a premeditated fraud that predated my mother's death by a full year. I photographed every page, sliding the documents back into the folder exactly as I had found them, checking the alignment of the tabs against the other folders, running my finger along the edge of the paper to make sure nothing was out of place. Then I relocked the cabinet with a click that felt like a lock clicking shut on my brother's future. I slipped back to the guest house as the sky began to lighten from black to charcoal, and I sat on the dabed, surrounded by beige pillows, and let the rage wash over me in waves. I was so angry I couldn't breathe for a moment, and I had to force myself to take slow, deliberate breaths, counting to 4 on the inhale and 6 on the exhale, a technique I used to calm myself before sending out 100 plates in a single service. I thought of my mother at her table, counting her dimes and stitches, and I let that anger crystallize into something useful, a plan. For the next several days, I maintained my daytime performance while I processed what I had found. I knew I needed professional help. I could not take a folder full of photographs to the police and expect them to launch a raid. I needed a forensic accountant who could trace the money, verify the forgery, and build a case that would hold up in court. I reached out to a chef friend in Boston, a woman named Maria who I had known for 20 years and who had once dissolved a partnership under ugly circumstances, her own brother having tried to steal her recipes and open a competing restaurant. She gave me a name on a slip of paper, Brenda Okonkwo. "She's a bloodhound," Maria said, her voice low even though we were alone in her apartment. "She found 50 grand my ex-partner had hidden in a supplier kickback scheme that 2 other accountants missed. She's expensive, but she's worth it, and she hates bullies." Brenda was a 55-year-old Nigerian-American woman with a PhD in forensic accounting from the University of Chicago and a reputation for being able to follow a money trail through 16 layers of shell companies. She worked out of a small office in Lowell that smelled like toner and old coffee, with a window unit air conditioner that rattled constantly, and a wall of filing cabinets that looked like they contained the financial secrets of half the state. She had testified in federal fraud cases so many times that the prosecutors knew her by her first name, and she had a way of looking at you over her reading glasses that made you want to confess everything you had ever hidden, even if you were innocent. I called her from a burner phone I had purchased at a Walmart in Framingham, paying with cash and wearing the same baseball cap I had not worn since a Red Sox game in 2004. I had driven 45 minutes to a store where no one knew me, walking the fluorescent aisles with a shopping cart holding nothing but the phone and a package of batteries, feeling like a spy in a movie I hadn't auditioned for. I activated the phone in the parking lot, using a prepaid card I had bought with cash at a gas station, and then I snapped the SIM card out of my regular phone and put it in a drawer at home, leaving it behind so no one could track my location. We arranged to meet Brenda at a diner off Route 3, the kind of place with sticky menus and bottomless coffee and a jukebox that still took quarters. The diner was nearly empty when I arrived, a few truckers at the counter and a teenager scrolling her phone in a booth. I wore the baseball cap and a shapeless jacket, and I had brought the burner phone in a Ziploc bag inside my purse, as if that would somehow protect the evidence. Brenda was already there, a sturdy woman in a gray cardigan, with reading glasses on a chain and a laptop case that looked like it had survived a war. She had ordered a coffee and a slice of apple pie, and she was eating it with the methodical focus of someone who savors every bite. I slid into the booth across from her and handed her a thumb drive with all my photographs and a handwritten timeline of what I had found, written on the back of a paper placemat I had taken from the guest house. She did not ask how I had obtained the documents. She just plugged the drive into her laptop, scrolled through the images for a few minutes, zooming in on the signature card and the bank statements, and then she looked at me over the top of her glasses. "This is substantial," she said, her voice low and calm, with a faint accent that only came out on certain words. "I can work with this, but you need to understand something. If I take this on, I will trace every dollar. I will follow the money through every transaction, every shell, every camouflaged entry. And if your brother has done what I think he has done, this will end in a criminal referral. There will be no going back. He will go to prison. Your relationship, whatever is left of it, will be over. Are you ready for that?" I thought about my mother's hands, the hands that had pushed that coffee can across the table, the hands that had sewn 1,000 hems to keep us fed, and I said, "I am ready." I liquidated my entire retirement account, a 401k I had built over 25 years with 6% contributions from my modest salary, always rounding down to the nearest dollar so I would not overdraw my checking account. It came to $87,402. I wired the entire balance to Brenda's firm, a retainer against her hourly rate of $350, and I did not let myself think about what it meant to be 60 years old with no savings and no safety net. If this failed, I would be destitute, but if I did nothing, I would be destitute anyway, because David's forged signature would eventually catch up with me, and I would be on the hook for debt I never authorized. There was no choice. There was only forward. Brenda took 11 days. She called me on the burner phone, using a code word we had agreed upon. She would say, "The Nakai is ready," and I would know it was her, and told me to meet her at a library reading room in Newton, a quiet place with old oak tables and the smell of bookbinding glue. I drove there in my Honda, taking a roundabout route that added 30 minutes to the trip, checking my mirrors for any sign of David or anyone who might be following me. When I arrived, Brenda was already there, her laptop set up in a corner, her binder beside her. She had a 3-inch thick document with color-coded tabs and a summary that made my vision swim. "Lena," she said, spreading the pages out, her voice as clinical as a surgeon describing a tumor. "The Marigold account has received a total of $347,612 over 12 years. That is the embezzlement. But there is something worse. Your brother took out a $500,000 Small Business Administration-backed loan in the company's name, secured by the company's real estate, equipment, and accounts receivable. The loan application lists you as a co-signer with a personal guarantee. Your signature on the SBA form is a forgery, identical to the one you photographed, meaning it was lifted from the same source document. If that loan defaults, and it is already past due on 2 payments, the bank will come after your personal assets. Your credit will be destroyed. You could face collection lawsuits, garnished wages, the loss of everything you have ever earned. And here is the truly elegant cruelty of it. If you had signed the buyout, David would have walked away with a clean company, free of the debt burden because he would have refinanced it into a new entity, and you would have been left with a forged signature on a $500,000 obligation and no company to generate income to pay it. The $500,000 buyout was not a payout. It was a trapdoor. It was a way to transfer his debt onto your shoulders while he danced away with the company, the assets, and the future. My hands were shaking so hard I could barely hold the report. I thought about the 3 a.m. alarms, the burns on my forearms from the steam table, the blisters from the pasta dough. The day I stood in the walk-in freezer and sobbed because a shipment of fresh seafood had spoiled, and we had to eat a $7,000 loss. The wedding I catered on a 98-degree day in August with a broken air conditioner, when the bride's mother screamed at me about the cake, and I just kept plating appetizers, my face a mask of calm because that was the job. And I realized my brother had been siphoning money the entire time we were building what I thought was a shared legacy, siphoning it into a pool deck and an Escalade and a vacation in St. Barth's, while I was driving a car with a cracked windshield and putting 6% into a retirement fund that I had just emptied to catch him. The grief I felt for my mother, the fresh, raw grief of losing her, curdled into something else, something colder and sharper and more focused than anything I had ever felt in a kitchen. This was not just betrayal. This was theft dressed in a funeral suit, stealing from the dead and the living alike. Brenda laid out the options with the detachment of a surgeon. A criminal referral to the local police would trigger an investigation that could take years, and the SBA loan payments would come due in the meantime, with my forged signature on the hook. A civil lawsuit would cost hundreds of thousands in legal fees, and David would bury me in delays and procedural motions until I ran out of money. Or we could do something more precise, something that would trigger an immediate collapse of his position before he could cover his tracks. We could tip off the bank's fraud department and the company's biggest client on the same day, with enough documentation to freeze the loan and cancel the contract. The resulting financial shockwave would leave David exposed and scrambling. And then, with the evidence in place, we could file a criminal complaint with the FBI's Financial Crimes Division through a suspicious activity report, which Brenda could file as an independent forensic accountant. The FBI would move faster than the locals, especially with an active bank fraud involved. I just needed to time it perfectly. And I needed a way to gather the final, undeniable piece of evidence that would tie David's own hands to the crime, something that could not be explained away as a misunderstanding or an accounting error. The originals of the Marigold Incorporation papers and the forged SBA documents, Brenda suspected, were not in the filing cabinet I had already searched. They were somewhere more secure, somewhere David felt they were safe. And based on my observations of his routines, I had a pretty good idea where. David had a locked briefcase that he kept in the trunk of his Tesla and never let out of his sight. It was a black aluminum Halliburton, the kind you see in spy movies, with a combination lock and a handle that he gripped like it contained nuclear codes. He carried it with him whenever he went to the office or to meetings, cradling it under his arm like a football. At home, it stayed in the trunk, and he kept the trunk release locked inside the car's software, only accessible with the key fob. But there was a valet key for the trunk, a small black plastic fob with a silver key, that I had once seen him pull from a zippered pouch in his office desk drawer when the main fob had a dead battery. I had watched him, that day, from the kitchen doorway, as he muttered about the fob's battery life and pulled out the valet key like a backup plan, and I had filed that information away without knowing why it might be useful. Now I knew. That valet key was my target. Getting it required a diversion, and I knew exactly how to create one, because I had spent decades learning how to manage multiple cooking stations while a dining room full of hungry people waited, and diversion was just another kind of timing. I spent a week observing the household schedule. Tiffany attended a spin class every Tuesday and Thursday morning at a boutique fitness studio in Wellesley, leaving the house at 9:15 and returning around 10:30. The housekeeper came on Mondays and Wednesdays. The gardener came on Fridays. David left for the office by 8 every day except Saturday, when he stayed home and worked from his study. That Thursday, an hour before Tiffany was due back, I went into the main kitchen, which I was allowed to use because I was supposedly too fragile to cook for myself, but still liked to make a cup of tea, the kind of harmless, domestic activity that reinforced my helpless image. I had saved a container of bacon grease from breakfast, a thick amber sludge that had congealed in a mug I had hidden under the sink behind the bleach. I had cooked bacon 3 mornings in a row, letting the grease accumulate, telling Tiffany I just craved something comforting. She rolled her eyes and said it was bad for my cholesterol. I poured the entire container down the garbage disposal, a thick, viscous stream that glugged into the drain, and then I flipped the breaker for that section of the kitchen, which I had located in the basement the week before during a lost trip to find the laundry room. The disposal jammed with a horrible grinding sound. The sink backed up with greasy water that smelled like a fryer that hadn't been cleaned since the Reagan administration, and the entire first floor began to fill with the stench of rancid fat, a smell so thick and foul that it would have gagged a health inspector. I called Tiffany, my voice high and quavering with practiced hysteria, and told her the sink was overflowing and I did not know what to do, and I was so sorry, so terribly sorry. I could not find the plumber's number, and I was too upset to think clearly. She shrieked, a sound like a cat being stepped on, and told me to call David immediately, her voice spiking into a register that made my phone vibrate. David called me 2 minutes later, his voice tight with irritation, the sound of a conference call in the background. "Lena, the plumber's number is in my desk drawer, the top right drawer in the home office, in a folder labeled Home Services. Can you just go in there and get it? I can't leave this meeting." I said I would try if I could just remember how to get to the office, my voice wavering with practiced confusion, letting a little sob catch in my throat. He talked me through it, the way you would talk a child through a simple task, and I shuffled upstairs to the office, pulled open the drawer, and found the plumber's card right on top, a crisp white rectangle with block lettering. But beneath it, in a small zippered pouch made of black nylon, was the Tesla valet fob. I pocketed it, my heart hammering against my ribs like a spoon against a mixing bowl, and then I called the plumber, my voice still shaky but my hands perfectly steady, and sat down on the floor and waited for the chaos to subside. That Thursday evening, as David pulled out of the driveway for his weekly car wash appointment, which he called his executive detail, and which took exactly 45 minutes at a hand wash place in Needham, I was already parked across the street in a rented gray Toyota Corolla that I had picked up from a lot in Dorchester, paid for with cash and a fake name. I had practiced using a fake name in the mirror. Maria Russo, here for the Corolla. I was wearing the baseball cap and sunglasses, a shapeless jacket I had bought at a thrift store, and I looked like 1,000 other middle-aged women in New England who no one ever notices. the invisible army of grandmothers and aunts and retired lunch ladies who move through the world like ghosts. David drove to the car wash, a place with a waiting area full of leather chairs and complimentary espresso, and I followed at a distance, keeping 2 cars between us, my hands at 10 and 2 on the steering wheel. He handed the keys to the attendant, declined the espresso because he was too important for free coffee, and disappeared into the waiting area, his head already bent over his phone. I waited until the attendant had driven the Tesla around to the wash bay, a process that took about 90 seconds, and then I walked across the lot as casually as if I were retrieving my own gym bag. I had timed it. The hand wash cycle took 20 minutes from start to finish, and the attendant was busy with a line of cars. The valet key fit the trunk lock perfectly, the little metal tooth sliding into the slot with a satisfying click, and the trunk popped open with a soft pneumatic hiss, a sound of expensive engineering yielding to a simple piece of metal. The Halliburton briefcase was there, tucked behind a set of golf clubs that had never seen a course, the grips still wrapped in plastic. I grabbed it, closed the trunk with a gentle press, and walked back to the Corolla, the briefcase heavy in my hand, my breath shallow but controlled. In a Target parking lot 2 miles away, I parked in a far corner, the one by the loading dock where no one ever looks, and got to work on the combination lock. It was a simple 3-digit roller, and I had brought a stethoscope-style auto-dialer I had bought on eBay for $40, a tool designed for locksmiths to open luggage that looked like a headset with a metal probe on the end. I placed the stethoscope's bell against the metal housing, pressed the probe against the dial, and turned slowly, listening for the tiny click and the change in resistance that marked the correct number. It was like listening for the moment when a custard sets, the exact threshold between liquid and solid, and I had spent a lifetime training my ears to hear those thresholds. 7 minutes later, I had the code, 412, David's birthday, of course. Inside the briefcase were the originals. The Marigold Incorporation papers, signed by David and Tiffany, with their passports as identification, the signatures bold and unashamed. The forged SBA loan documents, with my copied signature laid over the line in a different resolution than the rest of the page, a detail a good forensic examiner would spot in seconds because the pixels didn't match. And a handwritten ledger, in David's own script, a companion to the duplicate my mother had kept but far more detailed, a journal of greed. It detailed every transfer he had ever made, complete with small, smug notes in the margins. July 14 4K to Marigold Deck for pool, Deck 3 11K Tiffany's Escalade down payment, AUG 22.6, 5K vacation to St. Barth's, don't let Lena ask about the invoice. There was even a note from 2017 that said, Mom getting worse less oversight, good time to increase transfers. And that sentence, that single sentence, made me press my hand against my mouth to keep from screaming. It was a diary of theft, preserved out of pure arrogance, the trophies of a man who thought he was too clever to ever be caught. I photographed every page, every signature, every margin note, my phone's camera clicking silently, and then I replaced everything with the same careful alignment, relocked the briefcase, drove back to the car wash, and popped the trunk again before the final wax cycle finished. David never knew it had been gone. I drove back to the guest house, uploaded the images to Brenda's encrypted server using a secure connection from the library 2 towns over, and then I sat in the dark and let the full weight of what I had found settle into my bones. I was no longer just a chef. I was a weapon. Brenda called me the next morning, her voice tight with a rare emotion that might have been admiration or anger. It was hard to tell. "This is everything," she said. "The ledger in his own handwriting is a confession. The notes about your mother's decline are particularly damning. I am filing the suspicious activity report today with FinCEN, and I am going to contact a special agent I know at the FBI's Boston field office. This crosses state and international lines, so it is squarely in their jurisdiction. They will want to meet you." 2 days later, I met Special Agent Donnelly in a conference room at a public library in Waltham, a woman in her 40s with a no-nonsense haircut and eyes that did not miss anything. She sat across from me, her hands folded on the table, and she asked me questions for an hour. How I had obtained the evidence, why I had waited, what my relationship with David was like growing up. I answered honestly, leaving out the bits about breaking into the filing cabinet and the briefcase, but providing the documents themselves. At the end, she said, We can't arrest him on your evidence alone. We need the bank to trigger the freeze and the client to pull the contract. That will create a probable cause event, a clear and immediate financial crime in progress. When it does, we will be ready to serve a warrant for his financial records and seize the briefcase. Can you make that happen?" I said I could, and she gave me her direct number and told me to call her the moment I was ready. Before the confrontation, I needed one final piece of the puzzle, a piece no court would ever see, but that I needed for myself. I needed to know if there was any humanity left in my brother, any flicker of the boy who had once helped me push the broken cart through a rainstorm on our first day of business, the boy who had split his only Snickers bar with me on the school bus because I had forgotten my lunch. I knew the answer already, somewhere deep in my gut, but I needed to feel it in my bones so I would not waver when the moment came, so I would not hear a small voice whispering that maybe he could change, maybe he could be redeemed. So I staged a medical emergency. I bought a tiny Wi-Fi camera, the kind that looks like a clove of garlic and fits into a spice jar, from an online retailer that specialized in discreet home monitoring. It cost $80, and I had it shipped to a box I had rented in a strip mall in Natick, another layer of anonymity in the paper-thin disguise I was wearing. I installed it in the spice rack on the main kitchen counter, angled toward the center of the room, among the bottles of dried oregano and crushed red pepper. I tested it extensively, checking the feed on my phone from the guest house, adjusting the angle until I had a clear view of the entire kitchen. Then I waited for a moment when both David and Tiffany were home. The moment came on a Saturday afternoon, a lazy day when the air conditioner hummed and the pool filter gurgled. David was in the family room, his laptop open, muttering about a contract deadline. Tiffany was at the kitchen island, scrolling her phone, a glass of white wine sweating onto the marble, her manicured nails tap-tapping on the screen. I shuffled in, wearing my old cardigan and a look of vague distress, and I said, "I think I'll make some tea. My chest feels a little tight." Neither of them looked up. I filled the kettle, set it on the stove, and then I clutched my chest with both hands, let out a wet gasp, and crumpled to the floor. I had practiced the fall for hours in the guest house, learning how to fold my knees so I did not actually injure myself, how to make my breathing sound ragged and desperate, how to flare my nostrils and flutter my eyelids like a woman on the edge of cardiac arrest. I had watched videos of real medical emergencies, studied the way people's bodies went slack and their voices turned to whispers. I lay on the cold marble tiles, the floor biting into my hip through the cardigan, my hand clawing at the air, and I called out, my voice a thin rasp, "David, help!" My chest. He looked up. I saw it from the corner of my eye, my face pressed to the tile, saw him glance over the back of the sofa, his expression flickering through a series of micro-expressions I will never forget as long as I live. Surprise. Then calculation, the way a chess player recalculates a board when a piece moves unexpectedly. Then something that looked almost like relief, a relaxation around his mouth that said, "Well, this would solve a lot of problems." There was no alarm, no concern, no movement toward me. He did not move from his chair. He said, his voice perfectly even as if he were ordering a coffee, "Tiffany, can you check on her? I have this contract due in 20 minutes. It's the expansion deal. It can't wait." Tiffany, without looking up from her phone, without even a flicker of urgency, said, "I'm sure it's just anxiety, Lena. Honey, breathe into a paper bag or something. I'll call you an Uber to the urgent care if it doesn't pass." Her thumb kept scrolling, a steady, indifferent rhythm, up and down the screen, and she lifted her wineglass and took a sip. I lay there for 3 full minutes, my chest heaving, my fingers turning white from gripping the tile, while my brother finished his email and my sister-in-law applied a fresh coat of lip gloss from a little gold tube she fished from her pocket. Eventually, I made myself sit up, gasping theatrically, and staggered to the guest house, slamming the door behind me. The moment I was alone, the tears came, but they were not from sorrow. They were from a fury so pure and so white-hot that I thought it might burn through the walls, through the marble, through the very ground beneath their perfect house. He had stepped over my dying body without a second thought, because my dying body was an inconvenience, a delay in his timeline. I was not his sister. I was an obstacle, and obstacles in my kitchen got chopped. The date I chose for the confrontation was June 14th, the day David was scheduled to close a major expansion deal that would have merged Alina's kitchen with a regional food service conglomerate called New England Specialty Foods. The deal would have made him a multimillionaire, with a golden parachute and a seat on the board, and it would have left me as nothing but a footnote in the company's history. The original chef, mentioned in a press release. The closing was set for 2 p.m. at the downtown office of Regent Commercial Bank, the SBA-backed lender that had issued the fraudulent loan, in a conference room on the 17th floor with floor-to-ceiling windows and a view of the harbor. The tech company's CEO, Jonathan Hale, was scheduled to join by video conference to confirm the renewal of the catering contract, which was a key condition of the deal. David had invited me to attend, supposedly to witness the next chapter. But really, I knew, because I had been recording his phone calls with an app Brenda had helped me install, to finalize my buyout signature in front of witnesses, trapping me with social pressure and the presence of attorneys. He had no idea I had spent the last 3 months building a case that would burn his entire house down, foundation to chimney. The morning of the closing, I dressed carefully in my guest house bathroom. I wore my mother's pearl earrings, the ones she had worn on her wedding day and then sold to a pawn shop when my father left, only to buy them back, one earring at a time, over the next 10 years. I remembered the day she came home with the second earring, how she had held it up to the light and wept, and then she put them both on and stood a little straighter. I wore a black blazer she had helped me pick out in 2001, for my first meeting with a real supplier, a man who had looked at me like I was a housewife playing dress-up until I talked to him about bulk flour pricing and cold chain logistics, and he stopped smirking. I pinned a small brooch to the lapel, a tiny silver spoon my mother had given me on my 30th birthday. I tucked a thumb drive with Brenda's full report, the photos of the ledgers, and a copy of the new will into an inside pocket I had sewn into the blazer lining the night before, using a needle and thread from a tiny sewing kit I had kept since 1995. I called Regent Commercial Bank's fraud hotline at 9:17 a.m., identified myself as a whistleblower, and was transferred to a senior investigator named Marcus. I walked him through the evidence, my voice calm and steady, as if I were describing a recipe. He put me on hold twice, the hold music a tinny jazz that seemed absurd given the circumstances, while he reviewed the documents I emailed from a secure link Brenda had set up. When he came back on the line, his voice was clipped and professional, but I could hear the alarm beneath. "MS, Marchetti, we are freezing the loan effective immediately. We will have a team at the closing." I then called Jonathan Hale directly on his private line, the one he had given me years ago after I had saved a corporate event from a salmonella outbreak by catching a bad batch of chicken before it was served. He answered on the second ring. I told him, my voice as steady as I could make it, "Jonathan, this is Lena Marchetti. I am calling to inform you that the company you are contracting with has been engaged in systematic fraud, that its principal has forged my signature on federal loan documents, and that continuing this relationship could expose your organization to significant reputational risk and potential legal liability. I am sending you a file. Please review it before the call this afternoon." He was silent for 5 full seconds, the kind of silence that means a man is reading something that is making his blood run cold. I could hear him breathing, slow and deliberate. Then he said, his voice flat but with an edge of steel, "I'm opening it now. Lena, if this is true, you have my word. We are done with him. And I will make sure my board knows exactly who saved us from a disaster. I'm sorry you had to do this alone." I thanked him, hung up, got into my Honda, and drove toward the skyline with my mother's ghost-riding shotgun, the silver spoon brooch catching the light. The bank's conference room was on the 17th floor, all glass and chrome, and a view of the harbor that cost more per square foot than my mother's entire lifetime earnings. I walked in, and David was already there, in a navy suit that fit him like ambition-made fabric, his hair freshly cut, his smile already in place, the salesman's smile that had sold 1,000 lies. Tiffany was beside him in a cream-colored sheath dress, her hair blown out to helmet perfection, her hands folded on the table like she was posing for a magazine spread about executive wives. Arthur Kellogg, the bank's vice president, sat at the head of the table with a leather portfolio and a faintly uneasy expression, as if he had already been notified by the fraud department but was under orders to proceed as normal. On a large screen on the wall, Jonathan Hale's video feed showed him in his California office, his face unreadable, a cup of coffee beside him. David's attorney, a silver-haired man named Mr. Winters with a briefcase that probably had its own billable hours, was arranging a stack of documents with the reverence of a priest preparing an altar, sliding each page into a precise alignment. When I walked in, David stood and spread his arms, the gesture of a magnanimous king. "Lena, you made it. Come in, come in. We're just about to finalize the buyout. I have a pen all ready for you." He held up a heavy silver pen, the one with the company logo, and his smile was so bright and so warm and so utterly fake that I almost laughed out loud. I could see the script he had written in his head. The confused sister signs, the deal closes, he ascends to his rightful throne, and I am wheeled offstage like a piece of old furniture. I did not sit. I walked to the window, my back to the room for a moment, looking out at the harbor, the boats like white dots on a gray-blue plate, gathering the steel my mother had poured into my spine with every stitch she ever sewed. Then I turned and looked at my brother, and I saw the boy who used to steal quarters from my piggy bank, and I saw the man he had become, and there was no difference between them, only scale. "I'm not signing anything today, David," I said. "And neither are you." His smile froze, but his eyes tightened, the way a gambler's eyes tighten when the card turns over and it is not the one he needed. "Lena, come on, we talked about this. This is the big day. The expansion, the buyout, everything. Don't do this here, you're not well." He glanced at Kellogg, a look that said, "See, she is confused, ignore her." He reached for my arm, a gesture of false comfort, but I stepped back. I pulled the thumb drive from my blazer pocket and slid it across the polished table to Kellogg. It made a soft, hissing sound against the wood. "Mr. Kellogg, before you disperse any funds today, I strongly recommend you review the contents of this drive. It includes evidence that the SBA loan application was fraudulently executed, that the company has been systematically looted of over $340,000 through a shell entity controlled by David and Tiffany Marchetti, and that my signature on every document you have on file is a forgery. I am the majority shareholder of Alina's Kitchen, LLC, pursuant to my late mother's will, which I have here, and I am informing you that any transaction entered into without my valid consent is void and will be challenged in court." The room went so silent I could hear the hum of the air conditioning, the faint buzz of the video feed, and the distant sound of a boat horn on the harbor. Kellogg picked up the drive, his hand slightly unsteady, and plugged it into his laptop. On the video screen, Jonathan Hale leaned forward, his face filling the frame, his expression grim but not surprised, and said, "Arthur, I've already seen this file. My legal team is reviewing it now. We're postponing the contract renewal indefinitely, pending a full audit. David, I don't know what kind of game you're running, but my company does not do business with fraudsters. Consider our relationship terminated, effective immediately." David's face drained of color, a slow, creeping white that started at his jaw and moved up to his forehead like a tide receding. He turned to me, and for a moment the mask slipped entirely and I saw something ugly and desperate and scared, a cornered animal trying to remember where it hid the exits. "This is insane. She's unwell. She has dementia, just like our mother. She's been deteriorating for months. Tiffany, the medical records." "Show them." Tiffany fumbled in her designer bag, a black leather satchel that probably cost more than my Honda, pulling out a letter from her cousin, a family doctor who had visited me and asked leading questions while I pretended to be confused, a visit I had recorded on my phone. She thrust it at Kellogg, but it looked flimsy and desperate in the fluorescent light, a single sheet of paper against a mountain of financial evidence, a paper shield against a tidal wave. I smiled, and it was not a nice smile. It was a chef's smile, the smile of someone who knows exactly how long a sauce has been reducing and exactly when to strike. "The only thing deteriorating, David, is your house of cards. I have the original Marigold ledger in your handwriting, the one with the notes about the pool deck and the Escalade, and how Mom's dementia was a good time to increase transfers. I have a forensic accountant who has traced every single transfer back to a bank account in the Caymans in your and Tiffany's names. I have the new will, the one Mom signed in 2021, the one that leaves her shares to me and disinherits you if you contest it. And I have a nanny cam recording from your kitchen, from the day I collapsed and you stepped over my body because you had an email to finish. It's not admissible, but it made for an interesting conversation with the FBI agent I met last week. They are very interested in bank fraud and wire fraud and money laundering, it turns out. And the fact that you used the SBA to do it makes it a federal crime with a potential sentence of up to 30 years. Tiffany's face went the color of old mayonnaise. She opened her mouth, but no sound came out, just a thin, reedy squeak, like a mouse caught in a trap. Her wineglass, still half full, tipped over and spilled across the table, a slow creep of Chardonnay staining the pristine documents, and no one moved to clean it up. Kellogg was reading Brenda's report with the kind of focus a bomb squad technician uses on a suspicious package, his expression shifting from professional neutrality to cold, corporate horror. "David," he said, his voice quiet but carrying the weight of a vault door closing, "these documents are extremely troubling. I am freezing the loan immediately and referring this to our fraud department and the SBA's Office of Inspector General. I am also, in accordance with our anti-money laundering protocols, filing a suspicious activity report with the Treasury Department, if one has not already been filed. I'm afraid we will need to terminate this meeting and ask you to leave the premises." David lunged for the thumb drive, his hands scrabbling across the table like a crab on a hot rock, but I was faster, old kitchen reflexes taking over. I snatched it up and held it behind my back. "You can't delete the truth, David. It's already with the FBI. Agent Donnelly is waiting in the lobby, I believe, with a warrant for your financial records and that briefcase you keep in your trunk, the one with the combination 412, your birthday. You might want to call your lawyer, not this one." I nodded at the silver-haired attorney, Mr. Winters, who was already packing his briefcase with the expression of a man who had just realized his retainer check might bounce and his career might take a hit. He muttered something about needing to reassess his representation and slipped out of the room before the security guards arrived. 2 uniformed bank security officers appeared at the door, their faces impassive but their hands resting on their belts. David, his face now a blotchy red, began to shout. He said things I will not repeat, things about our mother and my mental state and a lifetime of grievances I had never known he carried, a torrent of bile that had been building for decades behind that salesman's smile. Tiffany was crying now, her perfect mascara streaking down her cheeks, her voice high and panicked, saying, "David, what about the house? What about the Escalade? What about my life?" She grabbed his arm, and he shook her off like a dog shaking off water. They were escorted out of the room, David still shouting, his voice fading down the corridor, and as the door closed behind them, I heard a final, desperate question from Tiffany, a question that summed up the entire tragedy. "Where am I supposed to go?" The last thing I saw was Jonathan Hale on the screen, nodding at me once, a small, grim nod of respect, before his feed cut out. I stood alone in the conference room for a moment, the spilled wine on the table, the abandoned pen still on the floor where David had dropped it, and I allowed myself one deep, shuddering breath before I walked out to meet Agent Donnelly in the lobby. The aftermath was not instant, but it was absolute. The FBI served their warrant that afternoon, seizing David's computers, his briefcase, and the entire marigold paper trail from his office and home. I watched them from the guest house window, the agents in their navy jackets moving through the Colonial, carrying out boxes, while Tiffany stood on the lawn in her bathrobe, her mouth open in a silent scream. The grand jury indicted him 3 weeks later on 8 counts of wire fraud, money laundering, and aggravated identity theft. Tiffany was charged as a co-conspirator, though eventually she took a plea deal that involved surrendering her stake in the Marigold account, cooperating fully with prosecutors, and divorcing David before the asset seizure could claim her own separate property. The divorce was finalized in 4 months, a speed record for Massachusetts, and she moved into a rental apartment in Framingham, taking nothing but her clothes and the Escalade, which the bank repossessed 2 months later when she could not make the payments. I saw a photo of her in the local paper, walking out of the courthouse in a coat that was too thin for the weather, and I felt a flicker of something that was not quite pity, but was not quite satisfaction either. The SBA loan was voided, and Regent Commercial Bank, to avoid litigation over their failure to properly verify the signature, issued a public statement clearing my name and released my personal guarantee in full. The tech company canceled its contract with David's entity, but reinstated it directly with me after I formed a new LLC, Lena's Kitchen 2.0, with Brenda as my acting CFO. I purchased the company's assets out of the bankruptcy proceedings, the trucks and the cafe and the production kitchen, and the old step van in storage, for a fraction of their value. Using the settlement from the civil lawsuit, I filed against David for breach of fiduciary duty, fraud, and conversion. The court awarded me $1.2 million in damages, plus legal fees, which David could not pay because his assets were frozen, so the judgment converted into a lien on his Wellesley house. When he defaulted on the mortgage because he had no income and no hidden accounts left to tap, I foreclosed on my own brother's home, and the house became mine. It was not an act of revenge, exactly. It was a restoration, a way of saying that the money that had been stolen from my mother's legacy would return to its rightful owner, brick by brick, dollar by dollar. I signed the deed on what would have been her 82nd birthday, and I swear I smelled lavender in the air. But I did not want to live there. The marble floors were too cold, the rooms too full of the ghost of a man I no longer recognized, the pool a monument to stolen hours of my labor. I walked through the house one last time before the foreclosure finalized, running my hand along the kitchen island where I had collapsed, and I felt nothing but a hollow, clean emptiness, like a pot scrubbed so thoroughly it had no memory of whatever had burned inside it. So I did something that surprised everyone, including myself. I offered to rent it to Tiffany. She had no income, no marketable skills, and a criminal record that made it impossible to find a lease anywhere else, a pariah in the same social circles she had once ruled. She had been a monster to me, a sneering, condescending accessory to my brother's theft, a woman who had stepped over my body to scroll her phone. But I remembered a moment I had witnessed years before, one I had not thought about until the night I held the deed in my hand. My mother was in the hospital, a bad spell of pneumonia before we moved her to the memory care facility, and I was sleeping in the visitor chair, exhausted from a double shift at the cafe. I woke briefly, the room dim, and I saw Tiffany sitting in the corner, alone, a small bouquet of grocery store flowers in her lap, the kind you buy at the checkout line. She was not on her phone. She was not checking her reflection. She was just sitting there, looking at my mother's face with an expression that was not pity or performance but something quieter, something that looked almost like grief. Her hands were folded around the flowers, and her shoulders were curved inward, and for just a moment she looked like a human being, not a caricature of greed. I closed my eyes and did not let her know I had seen. Maybe there had been a person in there once, before David's ambition had poisoned everything, before the money and the status and the desperate need to keep up appearances had hollowed her out. I do not know. I do not pretend to understand, but I offered her a 1-year lease at below-market rent, with a clause that any violation, any missed payment, any hint of disrespect, would result in immediate eviction and a call to the police. She takes my rent check to the bank every month, her hand trembling slightly when she hands it to the teller, and she does not meet my eyes. And that, for now, is enough. I am not her friend. I am not her savior. I am the woman who owns her roof, and that is a kind of justice, too. David's trial ended with a guilty plea and a 7-year sentence in federal prison. From his cell, he wrote me a letter, a thick envelope with his inmate number in the corner. I held it over the flame of my stove, the same stove where I had once taught him how to make our mother's marinara, how to stir the pot so the bottom didn't scorch, how to taste for salt with the tip of a spoon. And I watched the paper curl and blacken and turn to ash without reading a single word. Some bridges are not worth crossing again. Some recipes cannot be remade. The original catering cart, the 1987 Ford Econoline step, van with the ghost of Sal's Sausage Kingdom, still visible beneath the green paint, sits in a climate-controlled storage unit in Cranston. I visit it sometimes, when the world feels too heavy and I need to remind myself where I came from. I run my hand over the hand-painted Alina's kitchen, the brushstrokes still visible if you look closely, the little drip at the bottom of the E where she paused too long. I feel my mother's fingers in every curve, her voice in every bolt and rivet. I thank it for everything it taught me about resilience, about heat, about the way oil and water will never mix no matter how hard you whisk them. My mother's recipe box is framed in my new office, next to the red cloth ledger, and every morning I touch her handwriting and say, to no one but myself, I counted, Mama. I counted everything. The moral is not complicated, but it took me half a lifetime to learn and a few more months to earn. Trust is not a gift you give once and never audit. The people who love you will never ask you to be blind. And the ones who ask you to be blind are the ones you need to watch most carefully. Family can be a warm kitchen, a place where the sauce simmers and the bread rises, and the air is thick with the smell of garlic and safety. But it can also be a locked drawer full of forged signatures, and you will never know which it is until you find the courage to pick the lock. Have you ever discovered a dark secret about someone you trusted completely? How did you handle it? I want to hear your story in the comments. And if this video hit close to home, hit that like button and subscribe to the channel for more stories about the quiet women who finally learn to write their own endings. I'll see you in the next one.